Okay, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Glasgow Loves EU Lockdown Livestream. Tonight's session is the 19th of these conversations, and we're especially delighted to welcome Dominic Grieve. Thank you so much, Dominic, for agreeing to talk to us. My name is Fiona Wishlade, and also with us in the chat are Paul Miller and Bernd Poor. Paul is monitoring social media for questions that come on Facebook or Twitter, so please send in questions if you have them, if you haven't done so already. And Bernd is making sure that all the technology works for us and is recording the session so that people can watch it on YouTube later. Dominic Grieve really needs no introduction, I don't think, but maybe just a few points that set the context for our conversation this evening. First, he chaired the Intelligence and Security Committee, which produced the Russia report. He also played a leading role in the campaign for a people's vote following the Brexit referendum, so much so, in fact, that he was ejected from the Conservative Party before the last election and stood as an independent in his Beaconsfield constituency. And among other things, also importantly, in the context of the current internal market bill, he was Attorney General in the Cameron government. And this experience makes you, I think, particularly well placed, I think, to discuss the three topics that we've chosen for tonight. And these are the Russia report, Brexit, and some wider constitutional issues, especially the internal market bill that we wanted to touch on. Just a couple of points, I think, about us as a group. We're a non-party political group, Glasgow Loves EU, as is the European movement more generally. And we don't know too much about who our audience is, but we think it's largely a non-specialist audience, but with interest in a wide range of topics. So, turning first to the Russia report, just to kind of get the ball rolling, perhaps you could start off by explaining how the report came about. What was the motivating force behind having a report on this topic, and what for you were the most significant findings of the report?
The purpose of the inquiry was this: the Intelligence and Security Committee is a bipartisan, actually non-partisan committee consisting of 9 members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. If you came to our meetings, but they take place in secret, you wouldn't know who belongs to what political party, because the discussions have no partisan quality to them at all. And our job, that was created back in the 1990s, is to scrutinize the work of our intelligence services. And in addition to that, it now also includes the Central Secretariat in the Cabinet Office that collates intelligence and disseminates it to government, and also Defence Intelligence, which is a slightly discrete branch. And we have considerable powers to require the production of documents and call witnesses, although ultimately it's not a select committee of Parliament, and the Prime Minister does have certain powers of veto over what we can and can't do, but he has to give us reasons if he's going to exercise those. Often our reports are about particular incidents. We've looked at terrorism, for example, or the attacks in London and elsewhere, the Manchester bombing. But occasionally we want to look at a wider security issue, and we picked Russia because it was apparent to us, I think particularly after the Salisbury poisonings, that Russia's activity in the covert world merited attention. I'd like to emphasize the report was not about Russian involvement in the Brexit referendum. We did touch on that, but that wasn't the motivating reason for carrying out this inquiry. We wanted to look at the threat that Russia poses to us in the round. That includes espionage, I'm afraid subversion and murder, because Russia has murdered citizens on UK territory, and we know that this has happened. And how Russia is operating in our near abroad with our allies or against our allies, and where the risk factors are. and cyber activity, which is a very big topic, and the threat of Russian cyber activity. And we also wanted to look at subversion and influence. So it was a very wide-ranging inquiry indeed. And in order to do that, we heard from numerous members of the security services. We heard from independent thinkers outside of the intelligence services, but who have a view on Russia and what Russia is doing. And we had an opportunity to gain a picture of both what Russia is up to and our own responses to it and whether they're adequate. And we always knew that the difficult reality with this inquiry was that a lot of it was never going to be capable of being put in the public domain. So rather than producing a report and seeing it heavily redacted, we tried to produce a report that could be published, albeit we knew bits of it would probably be redacted. And then we published a significant classified annex, which goes to government, but at least it shows that, points out to ministers where we think that changes might be possible or improvements could be made. I'll come back to the publication of it in a moment, but what has come out of it and the significance for us. Russia is a very curious place. This is a state which in many ways is failing. It's failing economically, its population is stagnant, its economic output is not improving, and it is alienated in a rather extraordinary way from the international rules-based system, even though it claims to be part of it. And obviously its biggest single alienation and what has created the sanctions regime against it is it invaded a part of another country's sovereign territory and annexed it, the Crimea, quite apart from being a disturbing force in the Caucasus, Syria and the Middle East, and throwing its weight about. And it's sometimes very difficult to understand what Russia is trying to achieve, but Russia seems to see competition, particularly with Western democracies, as a sort of zero-sum game. And I'm afraid the evidence is overwhelming. It is prepared to resort to behaviors which between most states would not take place. Espionage is one thing, all countries, or a very large number of countries, spy on each other. But when you are actually trying to bring down countries' television systems as a random exercise in asserting yourself, and they've done this with at least one country in Europe for several days, or interfere with electoral and democratic processes, or indeed in one case try to carry out a coup d'etat in Montenegro, which was thwarted at the last minute, but the evidence that they were trying to do it is overwhelming. You have a country that presents a very real challenge for us. What were our conclusions? Well, some of them are quite good. One of them is that we have very good intelligence services, and our capacity to stand up, for example, to Russian cyber attack, which is happening all the time and is good. People have to understand that Russia is in a sense a mafia state, and this is the other strangeness about it. There is an intimate link between illegality and the regime. The regime tolerates illegality in Russia, tolerates fraudsters if it suits it, and then if it doesn't like it, it'll clamp down on them and send them off to Siberia. So it tolerates criminal activity by cyber criminals and almost certainly encourages it because that enables it to distance itself from the criminal activity, even though the criminal activity is being carried out in some apartment block in Moscow and is affecting people in Western Europe and this country. And it undoubtedly has carried out attempts at subversion of electoral processes, which I think is the topic which generated the most interest. We know that they did it for the United States. We know now because the government's told us, this was after our report came out, they did it for our general election. We were, and I think this was one of our conclusions, surprised to discover that no investigation had taken place as to whether they tried to do it in the Brexit referendum. And that appeared to be a policy direction from this government and its predecessor. Bear in mind, this isn't just Boris Johnson. I think this goes back to Theresa May. And we were startled by that because I think there are lessons to be learned from attempts at Russian subversion of electoral processes. Although I should emphasize that you're never going to be able to say whether it's been successful or not. if somebody is generating large quantities of bots to magnify an impression with public, you are never going to be able to quantify whether that is possible, whether that's working or being effective or not. But I think it's useful if we were to know if it's happening. Mm-hmm. So that's broadly what this very wide-ranging report was about. And I hope that people are better informed. Obviously, it became much more sensational because the government failed to publish it. And that's a slightly different story. You may want to ask me another question about that, so perhaps I should keep quiet at this stage. But the failure to publish became almost a bigger story than the content of the report itself.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose two things following up on that. I mean, the government has been pressed to hold an inquiry into whether there had been interference and has continued to resist it, saying that there is no evidence of successful interference, and therefore no grounds for an inquiry. Does that now mean that that's the end of the line for this as a topic? Is that story over?
Yeah, I think it probably is, because I can't force the government, and my committee can't force the government to carry out an inquiry. The government has a valid point to make, which is there is no evidence of successful interference. But if you want to investigate something, you've got to go away and find out if there is evidence.
It happened, yeah.
And that is the one thing that has not happened in this case. There has been other priorities, of course. The intelligence service have lots of things to do, but it is a decision has been made that this is not going to be inquired into, which is very different from what happened in the United States, for example, where following the realization that the democratic computers had been hacked, there then followed an intense review of what might or might not have happened during the US presidential election in 2016. And this is why we were concerned about this, because it's not about saying we're calling into question the referendum result. I should make clear there were several members of my committee who were supporters of Brexit. And that's as you'd expect in Parliament. There's probably a majority who were Remain supporters, but that's very relevant. We didn't approach it on that basis. What we approached it on is it would be desirable to know more about what Russia is doing in this area, because quite apart from anything else, there are lessons, I think, to be learned for the future. It's worth bearing in mind, states are fully entitled, if they want to express a view about other people's electoral processes. After all, President Obama came over during the referendum and indicated that he thought it was undesirable we should leave the EU, something with which I very much agree. But that's different from generating bots in a Moscow flat, which gives the impression to somebody living in Glasgow that large quantities of their neighbours think Brexit's a very good idea, whereas in fact those neighbours or people who appear to be in Scotland or the north of England or anywhere else don't actually exist at all.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, you've already mentioned or you've already alluded to the delay in publishing the report, which became a story in its own right. There's about a 9-month delay, I think, and it might have been longer if Julian Lewis hadn't supplanted the Prime Minister's pick for chair. I mean, what do you think about this? And isn't it quite a serious loophole in the system that the Prime Minister can try at least to bury a report that he or she doesn't like?
Yes. Equally, as I was explaining, the nature of this committee means that you can't really set it up as a select committee of Parliament. I'd love it if we could, but for a variety of reasons, the reality of national security is going to mean that the government is going to have a view about publication. And if it were a true select committee, the government couldn't control our findings or indeed redact anything that appeared inside it. I think it would be very difficult to do. Okay. But it does depend on a high level of mutual trust between the committee and the government and the agencies. And actually, we have the trust of the agencies. But I'm afraid the relationship with the government on this effectively broke down. We have a very well tried and tested system for publication. The committee produces its report. It submits it to the agencies and the Cabinet Office to be looked at. And they come back and say, look, there are various bits which need to be taken out. And then there's a an organized ping pong process, which goes in two phases. One was written response, and then we can push back and say, well, we agree with these, but we disagree with some of those. And eventually we all sit around the table. It's a consensual process, and we hammer out our differences. And we had concluded that process by late September last year. And as we knew there was a risk of a general election, the final stage is you prepare the document and you send it to number 10 Downing Street. And the agreed procedure is that the Prime Minister normally in 10 days clears it for publication. And he has no, I mean, unless there is some overwhelming national security reason for denying publication, the redaction process is over. There's nothing more to be done. And if the Prime Minister had a good reason not to publish, he should have rung me up, asked me to come over to number 10 Downing Street, even if he may not have liked me very much at the time. I was the chair of the ISC, and he should have said, look, Dominic, we can't publish it for X, Y, Z reason. But he didn't do that. He sat on it. And then they produced a series of what I'm afraid were entirely bogus explanations as to why they weren't going to publish before the general election. And it normally takes 6 weeks. No, it doesn't. It might take 6 weeks normally to a publication date, but that's a matter for the committee to select the publication date it wants, not for the Prime Minister to sit on it for 6 weeks. And of course, surprise, surprise, the moment the election was over in December, he announced he was happy to have it published. But of course, at that stage, there was no committee to publish it, and there wasn't a committee to publish it for another 6 months. That's why it took this long process, which was utterly predictable. Now, as for the government's motive, I have no idea. I mean, I think they made a mistake, actually. I think it attracted far more attention than it might otherwise have deserved. They may have been embarrassed over the fact that it was clear that the government had expressed no desire to know if the Brexit referendum had been tampered with. And they may have been concerned about the evidence that we also adduced, that by encouraging the presence of Russian oligarchs, or sometimes known, but a very big expatriate community in this country, some of whom, I should emphasize, are escapees of Russia and completely legitimate and probably want to do sensible business and send their children to English schools or Scottish schools if they happen to be in Scotland. There are some in Scotland. I've met them. Equally, there are some who still have considerable business interests in Russia and are ultimately client dependents of the Russian state. And they are agents of influence for the Russian state because they can't be anything else, because otherwise they won't be able to maintain their businesses in Russia. Yep. And it's important people should understand it. And that may have embarrassed the government because those links are something which past governments have encouraged. Actually, Labour did it as much as we did, but I don't think it's a very healthy relationship.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, you know, that perhaps made it all a bigger story in the end, because to some extent the published report is a bit of a frustrating read. You know, as soon as you come to what you think is going to be a juicy bit, you find it's been replaced with asterisks. Okay, that's been really interesting. But before we move on to the next topic, I don't know if Paul, you've got any questions that have come up from social media that you want to put to Dominic.
Well, just one, which is just thinking about this from the opposition's point of view. You know, is it basically up to a future government to think about a possible inquiry into Russian interference in Brexit? If you were leader of the opposition, would you be promising that? Is that a useful thing to do?
I don't know whether it's a useful thing for the leader of the opposition to do. Let's face it, unless something extraordinary happens, a Conservative government is going to be in office for the next 4 years. I mean, whether the Prime Minister lasts another 4 years is a separate issue. So whether in 4 years' time this is going to be an issue that people should give a priority to and should be trawled over, and which will undoubtedly take up resources to investigate, I'm not going to criticise the leader of the opposition for not raising it. I'm afraid I think the chances of this being looked into as a proper inquiry further down the track is very, very small.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, great. Okay, well, let's move on to the second topic, which is Brexit. We're now nearing inevitably the end game as we come to the end of the transition period, with the options reduced to no deal or to a thin deal. To what extent do you think it was inevitable that we would end up with a so-called hard Brexit, and why didn't we end up on any of the other paths to more of a to a less damaging compromise? Was it made impossible by the red lines or the intransigence of Remainers, or why have we ended up with such an extreme version of leaving the EU?
I fear it was inevitable, and it comes from the fact that Brexit, although many people voted for it in the name of what I call conservatism with a small c, they wanted to go back to something that had existed in the past and saw it as a restoration of tradition and a removal of some extraneous body that interfered with our sovereignty. But I'm afraid in practical terms, Brexit is a revolutionary act. It's the overturning of the existing order. And the difficulty is that once you have made that decision, the softer the Brexit that is then negotiated, the more it calls into question why you ever took that decision in the first place. And that, in a way, is what bedeviled Theresa May's government. I have absolutely no doubt that Theresa May saw Brexit as a mistake, albeit she probably wasn't very Europhile. I've known her for many years. We were friends at university together, but I mean, she wasn't very pro-Europe. But nevertheless, I think she did think it was a mistake. She set out to try to replace the EU relationship that we had with a close and special relationship outside of the EU of an exceptional character. But of course, what happens when you do that is it becomes more and more clear as she mapped out the route she wanted to take, either that she was asking for things that she couldn't get, or the price for getting them was a degree of integration into the European system that was completely unacceptable to the people who'd voted leave in the first place. And that's why progressively she ran into trouble with her own backbenchers and my colleagues in the ERG, for whom anything which had the merest smack of being looped into a system which had constraints on us was unacceptable. And I could see this grow. I mean, one of the reasons I ended up supporting the People's Vote campaign was that initially after the referendum, I thought, well, we're just going to have to make the best of this. But it became clearer and clearer to me, particularly once she'd lost her majority, that it was never going to be accepted, which was why I thought the best solution was to have a second referendum. And then at least the public could have, when it had a better idea of what the future had in store for it, could make a final decision on whether we should leave on those terms or not. Which of course the ERG and those colleagues absolutely didn't want, because they didn't wish to have this subject reviewed, precisely because I think it became clearer that we were in fact going to end up with something very different from what was being promised by the Leave campaign in 2016. Yep. So I'm not at all surprised we've ended up where we want to be, where we are. I think the Prime Minister would like a deal. I don't think the Prime Minister's mad. I think he knows how risky a total no deal Brexit is, but the thin deal we're going to get is very risky as well. But he's now boxed in. He's boxed in by his own rhetorical promises. And as he is by nature a gambler and a risk taker, unless he's confronted with a sense of immediate catastrophe by going down a no-deal route, for example, then if he's pushed to it, he may go for no deal because it's just easier than going for a thin deal and having to head off the people who will be dissatisfied even with that from the point of view of the constraints it puts on the UK.
Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot of the European press, which people of different nationalities in our group follow, a lot of that press think that the government's current positioning is posturing. It's playing hardball for a domestic audience. Treating the whole thing as if it's buying a second-hand car, and that the main challenge is to find a way of presenting an eventual deal as a victory. And there are only, I mean, there seem to be really two things left, which are quite different. Fishing, which has a sort of like a, you know, somewhat emblematic in the British conscience, and state aid, which is, you know, one of those technical nerdy topics, but where state aid specialists say, you know, there's a deal to be done, there are solutions there. So, I mean, why have we ended up here? What, you know, what do you think will happen now? Where will we end up? Because it does seem, from what specialists say, that a deal is actually within reach.
Yes, I think a deal is within reach. I find the state aid arguments very, very odd by the government. I mean, they are a sovereignty argument, because in practice, it's a form of sovereignty that I would have thought a Conservative government was most unlikely to want to exercise. So it seems to me that we are insisting on a freedom of action that we don't in fact need in practice for the country. And it ought to be capable of some reasonable solution. Fisheries, as you say, it's a symbolic, it's a totemic issue. In monetary terms, except for fishing communities, it is actually worth almost nothing to the UK. I mean, the value of the interconnector, the energy interconnector under the channel, is 6 times more valuable to the UK in export terms than the fisheries are. It just it disappears into nothingness. But as you know, particularly in Scotland, it is symbolic. After all, even the rise of the Scottish National Party was at least in part on the back of resentment against joining the EEC in the 1970s amongst the fishing communities in Peterhead and Aberdeen. So there is a history to this. And it's difficult to know how he is going to maneuver himself. His reasons for a deal, I think, are obvious. If there really is no deal, then there will be serious disruption. And the disruption will be evident, it will be obvious, and indeed it will require a negotiated settlement after we've gone, but have gone through that disruption. There will be negotiations next year. Yeah. A thin deal prevents disruption, but it doesn't solve the underlying issues. There will be large numbers of issues which I'm not sure they're really going to be touched on and dealt with at all. What about justice and home affairs cooperation, for example? We've got to have it, but I'm not sure it's going to be part of this deal. I think the thinness of this deal is, it will become apparent over months, even if we get it. But I think the Prime Minister wants a deal because he doesn't want the disruption which will happen without one.
Mm-hmm. So there's a certain amount of choreography having to go on to pull off a victory, as there was with the withdrawal agreement then, I guess.
Yes, I think so. And I'd be interesting to see whether he can get away with it. I mean, the withdrawal agreement was a piece of sleight of hand. It was obvious, and indeed Parliament to an extent fell for it, which I rather regret, because I would have held his feet to the fire for rather longer myself. We might have had the second referendum, but that's history. But it was a successful sleight of hand. But whether he can do it again, I don't know. I mean, it's a feature of this Prime Minister that he is, I'm rather critical of him. He is, can be very persuasive and optimistic, but it often has absolutely no concrete basis whatsoever. And he can also be remarkably successful deceiver of the public, including the willingness to say things which are outrageously untrue. How long can he go on getting away with it? He certainly got away with it last year. He sold the withdrawal agreement when it was obvious to all of us, well, many of us who looked at it, that the Northern Ireland implications were there from the beginning, and yet he's now tried to wriggle his way out of it. At some point, I'd like to think the public will get fed up with this and just say, we don't believe you anymore. But it is remarkable, its success over quite a long period.
Yeah, and we're not there yet with the public being fed up with it, I don't think. Okay, last question on Brexit before we see if Paul has anything from social media. How damaging do you think that Brexit has been to our relations with Europe, and you know, what can we do about it?
It's very damaging. Clearly, the United Kingdom, although it's a relatively small country, we've got 66 million people living here. I know it's fifth or sixth largest world economy. I'm never sure which it is, although that's likely over the coming years to go down as other economies rise. We have been, because of our history and our international engagements, we've been able historically to punch above our weight, which not above our weight, to punch to our weight. We've been a force and influence of good in the world, particularly in the last 40 years. And we've had a reputation for honouring our agreements and for being a stabilising force. So a country with which people want to do business and would like to have as their ally. And that reputation is damaged by Brexit. Of course, it's not the end of the world. You can rebuild it, perhaps outside of the European Union, although rather painfully, I worked for the Keep Britain in Europe campaign in the 70s. I remember what it was like before we joined, when UK economically was doing very badly, was not competing to the level of our European partners, was sliding down the global scale. And the interesting thing is a combination of joining the EEC as it then was, and then participating very actively in its development, even sometimes slightly confrontationally, but nevertheless participating, as Margaret Thatcher did, for example, delivered massive economic benefits. She created the single market. And we have, I think, certainly until the financial crisis of 2008, we thrived on it. It's made the UK what it is today. And I don't happen to think that the financial crisis of 2008 was terminal to our membership. It shows that the EU has some very severe challenges, but I'd much rather see us address those challenges inside the EU. And the damage it's done to our international reputation outside is very severe. And countries in the Middle East, not necessarily very countries, but respectable countries, who used to look to the UK and say, this is a good place. Just look at us and think this kind of place has gone to chaos. So I'm afraid our influence is reducing. And you can see that on the world stage. We've lost our seat on the International Court of Justice, the first time since it was set up. There isn't a UK judge. We're isolated in the United Nations on issues where in the past we would normally have been able to expect support. And reputationally, it's all very damaging to us. Not irrevocable, but it's not good.
Yeah. Okay. Right. I mean, we're going to move on to some of those wider issues in our last block. But Paul, are there any questions from social media on Brexit that Dominic hasn't already covered?
Yes, too many. I'm trying to sort of collate them.
I'll try and keep my answers short.
Some kind of sense. So there's a few along the general lines of just thinking about essentially the gap between what was sold in terms of Brexit and what the reality is, whether it's a slim deal or no deal, and just your views on how you see that playing out, because you could have a combination of a lot of discomfort and anger, an economic shock, and in some senses, a government that's kind of sliding into a slightly more authoritarian stance. So yeah, just wanted your views on that. And the other question is really about, do you think the US election is going to have influence on how that plays out?
On the first one, obviously, at various stages, including it was a criticism made of Remainers. George Osborne thought that if the vote went for leave, there would be an immediate economic shock, which actually doesn't really bear any relation to the underlying economy, but a withdrawal of credit and support for the UK, which would create a market crisis, which didn't in fact develop, or certainly not in quite the way he expected, but the pound fell and has never effectively recovered. The longer term trends, I think, are very bleak. For all the talk about deals with the United States, and this dovetails with the second question, I don't think they're going to happen. I don't think they'll happen with Trump. I don't think they'll happen with Biden. There's probably a slightly greater chance with Trump if we were prepared to accept some of the costs. environmentally and otherwise, but with Biden, I think it's most improbable. And yes, we may get trade deals with Australia, but that's very nice. But the impact on our overall trade is insignificant. So my personal take on this is that we will observe over the next 4 or 5 years that the UK is not again competing as well as it used to, and that our standard of living and our growth rates are not matching those of our European competitors. I might be wrong, but maybe the challenges the EU faces are so great that they are stagnating as well. But I think we will find that the outside world is a cold and rather hard place, and that we're struggling. And we will then have to decide what we do about it. And yes, that doesn't match what was sold in 2016. The sales pitch in 2016 was, you can leave the EU and yet you can keep all the benefits of EU membership without any of the irksome bits. And it just doesn't work. It was always apparent, if you want to pool sovereignty to achieve a common goal, you've got to accept the constraints that go with it. You can always get it back, but then you're going to have to accept the downsides that flow from it. And we don't in this country. I mean, a lot of people, and I sense this with many current Brexiters, they still don't seem to have got their head around this. Yeah, it's lovely to talk sovereignty, depending on what sovereignty you want. But the truth is, we're in an interconnected world, and it's countries that use their leverage to the best advantage of their citizens, particularly by means of international agreements, that thrive the most.
Okay, so just moving on then to our third topic, which we've sort of like broadly framed as constitutional issues, but probably with a particular focus, I think, on the internal market bill, which raises a number of important questions about the rule of law and judicial review. Many people will have seen the International Bar Association webinar that you did a few days ago, and if people haven't, then definitely recommend it, even for people who aren't lawyers. I mean, the message that came through from that is that we're really in trouble, aren't we? And for those who aren't black letter lawyers, can you maybe sort of briefly explain what your key concerns are about the bill?
There are two aspects to the bill. One I won't talk about now, but I'm very happy to talk about, and it's about creating an internal market within the UK. And there's some controversial issues about the relationship between Westminster and the UK Centre and the devolved parliaments and executives in Cardiff and Belfast and Edinburgh. And that's a complex problem. My only personal view about this is I think it could have been approached much better. But in fairness, the government had a challenge because of the repatriation of powers coming back to the United Kingdom, which in practice were not being exercised in the devolved authorities anyway. They were being exercised in Brussels. But nevertheless, there are legitimate complaints about the way the government has handled this. So that's one aspect. The real serious aspect is at the last minute, they introduced these new clauses, which are an override power on the withdrawal agreements. And indeed, not just the withdrawal agreement, but the Withdrawal Agreement Act that was passed only 9 months ago by the same House of Commons and the same Parliament. Now, for me as an ex-Attorney General, this is pretty breathtaking stuff. There are two sources of law in this country. There's obviously domestic law, which comes from our, in some cases, Scotland, your civil law tradition, in England, common law and statutory law, which is often identical for both Scotland and England, but sometimes different. And there is international law. International law has developed over hundreds of years, but particularly in the last 50 or 60, and since the Second World War. And international law is the absolute contractual underpinning of assurances given between states freely entered into about how they're going to operate. And the United Kingdom has been at the forefront of its creation. I mean, I once made an inquiry of the Foreign Office as to how many treaties we were signed up to, and the figure they gave me in 2013 was 13,200, which are currently still binding on us, and about 800 of them have arbitral mechanisms for resolving disputes. I think the figure has since gone up to about 14,000. We're the biggest treaty-making power in history on the planet, and we've done it for reasons of self-interest, because it provides mutual assurance between countries about the way they're going to behave. Now, in the context of the withdrawal agreement, the Good Friday Agreement for the peace of Northern Ireland and its tranquility is key. UK, it's a treaty that's now stood the test of some time. It's not perfect, but it's probably prevented violence in Northern Ireland. And the withdrawal agreement and the Northern Ireland Protocol was a recognition of trying to address the problem in Northern Ireland of split identities, and trying to make sure that those respect for different identities could be maintained thereafter, when the original Good Friday Agreement had presupposed that both the United Kingdom and Ireland would be in the EU together. To suddenly renege on the agreement, or to threaten to renege, or even to introduce into Parliament legislation which says that it's going to give ministers of the Crown the power to renege on it, is a flagrant breach of your international treaty obligation, because even if you haven't done it, it's a breach of the good faith that exists between the parties, and which is specifically provided for in the withdrawal agreement. And on top of that is a specific requirement of any international treaty under the Vienna Convention. So that a government, Westminster government, should introduce such a measure, get it signed off by its law officers, which in itself is breathtaking, because it's their duty to uphold the international rule of law, and it's in breach of the Prime Minister's own ministerial code. He hasn't changed the code. He's just pretended that the code doesn't say what the code actually says. He said the rule of law, it doesn't include international law. Well, that is a pretty breathtaking statement, particularly as there was a Court of Appeal case in England only a few years ago which said it did, because the government said it did. Indeed, the government argued it did at the time. So this is a pretty extraordinary thing to do. And one of the curiosities of it is not just that the government has chosen to do something which I think is very bad, but what I find even more worrying is they don't seem to have realized just how adverse the reaction was going to be. So that they have a situation where even peers in the House of Lords like Michael Howard, who's a very, very ardent Brexiteer, has said that he regards this legislation as being completely unacceptable. And indeed, the bishops of the Church of England, indeed the Episcopal Church of Scotland, have said today that it is unacceptable. And the bill has no prospect of getting through the Lords in its current form. I'm absolutely sure they will take the clauses out. If the government insists on keeping them, the bill will collapse. And then the government would need a new session of Parliament to force this legislation through, and would have to have that before the 31st of December, because it needs the other bits of the bill by the 31st of December to preserve a UK internal market. So, I mean, it is showdown time, and I can't make up my mind if this is Mr. Cummings wanting to have a culture war with the judiciary and the House of Lords and everybody. The other aspect of it is that it also seeks to oust the ability of the courts to review the ministerial decisions which are made subject to the legislation that's being enacted. And that is unprecedented and could well produce a constitutional clash with the senior judiciary, who will not like it at all, because it is quite contrary to our national practice.
Yeah. I mean, you know, you've talked just now about whether they've misjudged the reaction that there might be to the bill. And clearly parts of it are sort of like necessary in order to sort of like paper over the cracks that are left by withdrawing from the EU. But to what extent do you think that putting in those notwithstanding clauses was part of this brinkmanship in the trade negotiations with the EU?
I think it was. I think that was the intention. I think the intention was that they had reached I don't think there was another intention, because I can't work out why they've done this. This is the only one that makes sense, and that is that they wanted to show you're getting difficult with us. We are prepared to get really, really difficult with you, even to the point of ripping up an international treaty because we think you're not behaving properly towards us. So I think that was the intention. Now, has it worked? Well, I don't think it has. I mean, I think that it has damaged our reputation internationally. You've seen Mr. Biden saying this is unacceptable, effectively. You certainly won't be getting a trade deal from us if you behave like this. Yeah. I think our European partners, the ones whose representatives I've spoken to, I think they just found it jaw-dropping. Yeah. Of course, other countries have behaved like this in the past, but for the UK to do this, it's a serious dent. I think everybody's hoping it'll go away, that there will be a deal, and that therefore the necessity for this will disappear. But do I think it's influenced the way the EU is negotiating with us? I think it's very unlikely. Yeah. I think they've actually chosen almost just slightly to ignore it. So I don't think it's had the desired result, although somebody in Downing Street might say, oh yes, it has. You know, that's why they're now talking today in slightly different terms. But the EU's always been wanting to do a deal with us. Whilst I'm sure the EU can at times be unreasonable in its negotiation, I don't see them as angels. They're representing EU interests. Yeah, sure. The posturing is entirely a UK phenomenon and shows, in fact, our weakness in this negotiation.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, a lot of the things that you've said this evening, point to a kind of move fast and break things phase in UK politics. Whether it's the rule of law, judicial review being called into question, and numerous other things. I wonder which of these things worries you the most, and can we sort of expect normal service to resume anytime soon, and how do we get there?
It's a difficult question to answer. You could argue that if we get through the 31st of January in one form or another, and transition is ended, and we are hopefully in a thin deal, but something that prevents chaos. But even if we're in a degree of chaos, that actually some of these issues may disappear because the government will need a structured order rather than creating chaos to achieve its political ends. And so there's a bit of me which thinks that actually things will calm down. There is a risk that the Prime Minister, being so embattled and apparently so incompetent, come back to that in a minute, may want to continue with it and find that the people he relies on most, there is a sort of Maoist streak in Mr. Cummings and his sort of entourage, which do want to smash things up. I mean, they are not conservatives. They may be neocons, but they are definitely not conservatives. As I understand conservatism as a conservative myself, it just doesn't fit. So they might be urged to continue or to pick new culture wars. But I just wonder, because for all the comment, I look at the parliamentary party I used to be a member of. There are still a lot of people there who are conservatives. And even the new Red Wall conservatives who represent working class seats, I don't think their interest is in constant revolution. My feeling is that the Prime Minister's leadership is very much in question now. It may be that order will only be restored when he's gone. The question is how long he's able to continue, because unless he produces rabbits out of the hat over COVID, on which he's now subject to a great deal of dissent and criticism in the Conservative Party, probably deserved, not so much because of the decisions he's taken, but the zigzagging all over the place and the total lack of leadership, which is what's really doing him in. But that, coupled with a Brexit that delivers economic problems of a continuing kind, which exacerbates the COVID ones, there's a bit of me which thinks it's going to be fatal to him. And unfortunately, I think he's a bit of a one-off. I don't think we're about to get anything quite similar again. That's my hope.
Okay.
And so for that reason, I find it hard to believe we are still going to be in chaos of the kind we seem to be experiencing now in 12 months' time. But perhaps I'm being over-optimistic.
Okay. One last, we're kind of running out of time, sadly, but one last question on this block before we see what Paul has from social media, and it's on a slightly different constitutional issue. Now, in the independence referendum, EU membership was one of the reasons given by the government for voting no, and the polls are now showing growing support for Scottish independence, partly owing to Remainers seeing this as a route back into the EU. As a unionist, what do you say to these arguments?
Well, I can understand why support for independence is growing in Scotland. I mean, I predicted it 12 months ago. It seems to me that if a country which has devolved administrations carries out an act as revolutionary as Brexit, when there are when in some of the devolved areas, particularly Scotland, which has its history as an independent, as a country, the view is opposite. You are going to create very great problems and tensions. I don't think, as a unionist, that independence is going to solve that problem. We think that the Brexit divorce is difficult. I have to say, I think it's going to be nothing as complex and difficult as a divorce would be if there were to be a decision that Scotland should separate from the rest of the UK. I think it would be a very difficult and rather traumatic and disruptive time, which will just add to the disruption that we've had. Whether it's a way back into the EU for an independent Scotland is difficult to judge. I have no doubt that the EU might be interested in having an independent Scotland back, but an independent Scotland would presumably have to join the euro, would presumably, depending on the relationship of the rest of the UK stroke England with the EU, would create tariff barriers. And as our two economies, England and Wales and Scotland, are intimately integrated, that is going to be, it seems to me, very damaging on both sides. And I think we will all be diminished by it. That said, I acknowledge and recognise why people in Scotland should feel very irate about what's going on. And if on top of that, the Westminster government appears incompetent, that's another reason for saying, why should we share in this generalised incompetence when we might find something else? But I personally think that the Union of the United Kingdom, my family come from Roxburghshire. I think prior to the Union, we were probably cattle thieves. And the truth is, it delivered peace, it delivered tranquility, and it delivered economic growth in the agricultural sector, which turned my forebears into leading sheep farmers in the early 19th century, winning all the prizes with those gigantic sheep, which you see in those rather lovely, slightly naive paintings. And the economic growth and benefits that came from it were colossal. And I have to say, my personal view is that if we separate, we will each side will pay a very heavy price for it, which as a unionist, I think is undesirable. But then that's a challenge for unionists to come up with a better future, working together. Okay, well, it remains to be seen whether there is a referendum, of course, and a chance to put those arguments. Okay, so before we wrap up, Paul, have you got any questions from social media that you want to put to Dominic on that on that block?
Again, far too many, but a few definitely asking about the state of the union and the future of the union, but also some other questions just about kind of general levels of concerns about levels of dishonesty and corruption in current government, and feelings of kind of frustration about being powerless really as members of the public to address that other than through the ballot box. And, you know, are there other ways of addressing that, or is that it?
I mean, I think we must be careful with corruption. The United Kingdom historically has been a country where levels of corruption are very low. Particularly, we have an uncorrupt judiciary, which is a wonderful thing to have. Some European Union countries which don't have that, unfortunately. We have, I think, an uncorrupt civil service, with occasional exceptions, but I think we're very fortunate. And I think levels of political corruption, relatively speaking, they're not unknown, but I think they're quite low. But I think we're also desperately complacent about this. I'll say that straight off. I think that we're living, particularly in a globalized world, where we just assume that that will continue. Whereas actually it is now under, I think, we've discussed it in the Russia context, but there are other contexts in which I think it is potentially much harder to maintain. And as I say, my concern is that when you carry out disruptive politics, breaking the status quo, saying there's going to be a hard rain falling on the civil service, you're creating the very climate in which people start to feel disinhibited about making alternative arrangements. I know that government can sometimes in the UK be quite slow, slightly sclerotic, and sometimes slightly unimaginative, but that is in part a reflection of its caution and sometimes of its probity. And it's when you start taking the shortcuts that you start to run risks. And if you want to reform things, you need to keep that very much in mind. And the problem is that we now have a government that is reckless. The recklessness that underlay the arguments in the referendum has stayed with us because it was a reckless act, however you look at it. Mm-hmm. And I'm afraid we're living with the consequences, and we need to try to get back to a much steadier state. But we're not going to get there overnight. And it affects us all. So yes, I do worry about it.
Okay, well, just one last question to wrap up. So Glasgow Loves EU is a small local group affiliated to European Movement in Scotland, which of course is part of the wider European movement in the UK. And I know that you're on the council of that. What do you say to groups like ours? You know, we've been down to London going on marches. You know, what can and should we be doing now? And are there any grounds for optimism for people of our disposition?
Yes, there are, but I think we have also to be realistic. We discussed this at our recent council meeting of the European movement. One way or the other, we have left the EU. We can't just go back in tomorrow. I know that transition has masked it. We have another 2.5 months where we can almost pretend we're still in, even though we're not. But then we're going to be gone. And clearly, we can still try to influence the outcome in terms of getting a thin deal, because that's better than no deal at all. That's about lobbying MPs. There was a lobby day. I think that's the best way of going about it. Trying to get business, who often, I'm afraid, hide below the parapet, to point out just what the consequences of no deal will be for them. I think that's the best thing we can do at the moment. Okay. Thereafter, I happen to think that over the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years, there is going to be a really good argument, because it's just going to come naturally. Each and every month, there will be something that crops up where there is an argument saying, but we need a closer relationship with our neighbours about this. And, we used to have it and we don't. Can we do something about it? And rather than just immediately reopening the issue of we need to rejoin, which brings with it a whole host of difficulties, I personally think that the best thing that we can do as members of the European movement is to be actively campaigning at both micro and macro level for a closer relationship, because it happens to make sense on a particular issue. Whether it's your twinning association and maintaining those links, whether it's arguing for building on Erasmus and exchanges of students, the fact that younger generations simply are anybody under the age, there's a vast majority of young people under the age of 30 who believe that we've made a terrible mistake, and wanting to build that relationship for the future, And when problems arise, like Justice and Home Affairs saying we've got to have a deal. We've got to get something that sorts out a mutual recognition of judgments and their enforceability without going through complex things like the Lugano Convention, which are not going to work anything like as well as the arrangements you've got at the moment. That, I think, is what we should be doing. And saying, Europe is where we happen to be. Of course, I'm happy to have relations with Australia or New Zealand, or lovely things to have, but they're not our neighbours. And I think that's the powerful message that the European movement can build on. But I recognise that it also, we fought so hard. I mean, I recognise all the people who came to help me when I stood as an independent last year, that poured out in their hundreds into my constituency to help. And we came together on the marches, and it was a bit epic. And there's a sense that, well, it didn't work. And so there's a risk that people may just give up. And I don't think they should, because in truth, history is on our side about this. It's abundantly and overwhelmingly clear that if we want to live a decent future, decent from an environmental point of view as much as economic, decent for a good future for our children, it's the partnership with our European neighbours which is going to be critical to achieving this. So I think that's the message, and I think that's what we should go for.
That's fantastic. Really good to end on a positive note. Thank you so much for joining us on this conversation. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to do.